Want to know the one thing that truly unsettles a narcissist? It's not revenge, it's not confrontation, it's something far more powerful and much quieter. Because the truth is, narcissists don't suffer when you fight them. They suffer when you stop playing the game they depend on. Today, we're talking about 5 psychological shifts that quietly torture a narcissist, not through cruelty, but through strength, clarity, and emotional freedom. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to the channel right now. This space is dedicated to protecting your peace and strengthening your mindset. Share this video with someone who may be dealing with a narcissist, and comment "My peace comes first" if you are reclaiming your power. Emotional detachment is one of the most powerful shifts a person can make when dealing with a narcissistic personality. At first, the concept may sound simple, but in practice, it represents a deep psychological change. Narcissistic individuals rely heavily on emotional reactions from the people around them. Those reactions become a form of fuel that keeps their sense of power alive. When someone reacts with anger, frustration, tears, or desperation, the narcissist often interprets it as proof that they still control the emotional atmosphere. This is why many interactions with narcissistic people feel exhausting. Conversations that start small can suddenly escalate into arguments. A simple disagreement can turn into criticism, blame, or emotional pressure. The goal is not always to resolve the issue. In many cases, the conflict itself becomes the stage where the narcissist can dominate the interaction. Emotional detachment quietly removes that stage. When a person becomes emotionally detached, they stop participating in the emotional storm the narcissist tries to create. This does not mean they stop caring about themselves or their well-being. It simply means they refuse to let someone else control their emotional responses. Instead of reacting impulsively, they respond with calm awareness. For example, imagine a narcissistic individual making a sharp criticism or an insulting remark. In the past, that comment might have triggered anger or the need to defend oneself. The conversation could spiral into a long debate where both people become increasingly frustrated. But emotional detachment changes that pattern. Instead of reacting emotionally, the person might simply acknowledge the comment without engaging in the conflict. They may respond briefly, or sometimes not respond at all. The emotional intensity that the narcissist expected simply does not appear. For the narcissist, this can be incredibly unsettling. Narcissistic personalities often measure their influence by the reactions they provoke in others. When someone becomes angry, defensive, or upset, it signals that the narcissist still has access to that person's emotional core. That access reinforces their sense of power, but emotional detachment removes that access. The narcissist may attempt to escalate the situation, hoping to break through the calm surface. They might repeat the criticism, increase the intensity of their remarks, or introduce new accusations. These tactics are designed to provoke a reaction. If the person returns to emotional engagement, the narcissist regains the familiar dynamic. However, when calmness remains steady, the narcissist begins to encounter something unfamiliar, a lack of control. This absence of reaction can feel almost like psychological resistance. The narcissist may struggle to understand why their usual methods are no longer working. The emotional energy they expected to receive simply isn't there. It is important to understand that emotional detachment is not about suppressing feelings. Suppressing emotions often leads to internal stress and resentment. True detachment is about recognizing what belongs to you emotionally and what does not. The narcissist's anger, criticism, or dramatic reactions are expressions of their internal struggles. They are not reflections of your worth or your stability. When someone understands this clearly, it becomes easier to remain calm in situations that once triggered strong emotional responses. Another aspect of emotional detachment is the shift in focus. Instead of concentrating on the narcissist's behavior, the person begins focusing on their own mental peace. They stop trying to change the narcissist, prove themselves, or win every argument. They recognize that many narcissistic conflicts are designed to pull them into endless emotional loops. By stepping back from that loop, they conserve energy and clarity. Over time, emotional detachment also changes how the narcissist views the interaction. If their attempts to provoke reactions consistently fail, they may feel frustrated or bored with the dynamic. The attention they once received from emotional conflict gradually disappears. This does not always mean the narcissist will change their behavior. In many cases, they may search for other sources of emotional supply elsewhere. But the important transformation occurs within the person who has chosen detachment. They reclaim control of their emotional world. Instead of reacting automatically to every criticism or provocation, they choose how and when to respond. They become less vulnerable to manipulation and more grounded in their own sense of stability. For many people who have spent years dealing with narcissistic personalities, this shift can feel incredibly liberating. The constant tension begins to fade. Conversations become shorter, clearer, and less emotionally draining. The narcissist may still attempt to provoke reactions, but those attempts no longer have the same power, and that is where emotional detachment becomes quietly transformative. Without emotional reactions to feed on, the narcissist loses one of the most reliable sources of validation and control. The dramatic atmosphere they once relied on begins to disappear. What remains is calm distance. And for someone who thrives on emotional influence, that calm distance can feel like the most uncomfortable silence of all. Now expand the second keynote with no saboting in detail. Output in 700 words. Strong personal boundaries are one of the most disruptive forces a narcissistic person can encounter in a relationship. While the idea of boundaries may sound simple, their impact can be profound, especially when dealing with someone who is used to operating without limits. Boundaries define what behavior you accept, what behavior you do not accept, and how much access another person has to your time, energy, and emotional space. For many people who interact with narcissistic personalities, the absence of boundaries is often what allowed the unhealthy dynamic to develop in the first place. Narcissistic individuals tend to test limits early in relationships. These tests can be subtle. They may interrupt your plans, dismiss your opinions, criticize your choices, or expect immediate responses to their demands. At first, these behaviors may seem minor, and people often accommodate them to avoid conflict. Over time, however, these small accommodations accumulate. The narcissist begins to assume that their needs will always come first and that their expectations will be met without resistance. They may call at inconvenient times, demand emotional reassurance, or pressure you into decisions that do not feel right for you. Because there were few consequences early on, the narcissist interprets the situation as permission to continue expanding their influence. This is where boundaries begin to change the dynamic. When someone introduces a clear boundary, it sends a message that the previous pattern will no longer continue. A boundary might sound like, "I'm not available to talk about this right now," or "I can't help with that today," or "that comment was disrespectful." These statements are not aggressive, but they are firm. They define a limit. For a narcissistic individual, this moment can feel surprising or even threatening. Narcissists often operate with a strong sense of entitlement. They may believe they deserve special treatment or that others should naturally adjust to their preferences. When someone suddenly limits their access or challenges their behavior, the narcissist may interpret it as disrespect or betrayal. Because of this, the first response to boundaries is often resistance. The narcissist may react with anger, sarcasm, or guilt tripping. They might accuse the other person of being selfish or overly sensitive. They may attempt to minimize the issue by saying things like, "You're overreacting," or "You're making a big deal out of nothing." In some cases, they may even play the victim, suggesting that the boundary is unfair or hurtful to them. These reactions are not accidental. They are often attempts to push the boundary back into the place where it once was, non-existent. If the person setting the boundary becomes uncomfortable and backs down, the narcissist learns that persistence will eventually restore their control. This is why consistency is so important when establishing boundaries with narcissistic personalities. A boundary that appears once and then disappears quickly loses its power. But a boundary that is repeated calmly and consistently begins to reshape the dynamic. It teaches the narcissist that certain behaviors will no longer be tolerated. Another important aspect of boundaries is emotional neutrality. When people first begin setting limits, they may feel angry or frustrated because of past experiences. While those feelings are understandable, boundaries are often most effective when delivered calmly. The goal is not to punish the narcissist, but to protect your own well-being. When a boundary is expressed calmly, it removes the drama that narcissists often use to manipulate situations. There is no shouting, no insults, and no long arguments. The message is simply repeated when necessary. For example, if someone says, "I'm not discussing that topic," and the narcissist continues to push, the response remains the same. "I've already said I'm not discussing it." The conversation does not expand into endless explanations or justifications. Over time, this pattern becomes difficult for the narcissist to navigate. Many of their usual strategies rely on emotional reactions or confusion. When the boundary remains stable and calm, those strategies lose effectiveness. Boundaries also restore balance within the relationship. Instead of one person constantly adapting to the narcissist's needs, both individuals now have defined spaces. The person setting the boundary regains control over their schedule, their energy, and their emotional health. This shift can be deeply uncomfortable for the narcissist because it removes a sense of automatic authority they once had. They can no longer assume that their requests will always be met or that their behavior will always be tolerated. It is important to remember that boundaries do not guarantee that the narcissist will change their personality. Some narcissistic individuals may continue testing limits or searching for ways around them. However, boundaries change the role you play in the dynamic. You are no longer the person who absorbs every demand or criticism without resistance. Instead, you become someone who clearly defines what is acceptable in your life. For people who have spent years accommodating narcissistic behavior, this shift can feel empowering. It allows them to reclaim their time, protect their emotional energy, and interact with greater confidence. And for the narcissist, each firm boundary represents something they struggle to accept, a clear reminder that they do not have unlimited control over another person's world. Now, expand the third keynote with no subbotting in detail. Output in 700 words. Independence is one of the most unsettling things a narcissistic person can encounter in a relationship. It does not involve yelling, confrontation, or revenge. Instead, it is a quiet shift in how a person thinks, acts, and makes decisions. For someone who is used to influencing others and shaping their behavior, this quiet independence can feel like a serious loss of control. Narcissistic personalities often gravitate toward relationships where they can hold a position of influence. This influence may not always be obvious in the beginning. Sometimes it starts with charm, confidence, and the appearance of strength. The narcissistic individual may present themselves as someone who knows better, someone who has more experience, or someone whose opinions should carry more weight. At first, this can feel attractive or reassuring to the other person. Over time, however, this dynamic can slowly create dependence. The other person may begin seeking the narcissist's approval before making decisions. They might ask for guidance on personal choices, adjust their behavior to avoid criticism, or hesitate to move forward without reassurance from the narcissist. These patterns can develop so gradually that many people do not realize how much influence the narcissist has gained over their thinking. This dependence becomes an important source of power for the narcissist. When someone relies on them emotionally or psychologically, the narcissist feels significant and important. Their opinions become central, their reactions become meaningful, and their approval becomes something the other person feels they must earn. Independence disrupts this structure. When a person begins to trust their own judgment and make decisions confidently on their own, the dynamic starts to shift. Instead of constantly checking for approval, they listen to their own instincts. Instead of organizing their life around the narcissist's expectations, they begin focusing on their own priorities and values. For a narcissistic individual, this change can feel threatening because it reduces their influence. The person they once guided or controlled now appears self-directed. Their choices are no longer shaped by fear of criticism or the desire for validation. One of the reasons independence affects narcissists so strongly is because it challenges their sense of superiority. Many narcissistic individuals quietly believe that they are more capable, more intelligent, or more insightful than the people around them. This belief allows them to justify their controlling behavior. They see themselves as the authority who should be listened to. But when someone begins making confident decisions without consulting them, that belief is disrupted. The narcissist begins to realize that their guidance is no longer required. Their opinions may still be heard, but they are no longer treated as the final authority. This can lead to several reactions. In some cases, the narcissist may attempt to undermine the independence they see developing. They might criticize the person's choices, suggest that their decisions are foolish, or predict that things will go wrong without their involvement. These comments are often designed to create doubt. If the person begins questioning themselves again, the narcissist can slowly reestablish their influence. In other situations, the narcissist may try emotional strategies to restore the old dynamic. They might express disappointment, act distant, or imply that the independent behavior is a form of betrayal. These responses can create guilt, which sometimes pulls people back into seeking approval. However, when independence remains steady, these tactics gradually lose their effectiveness. The narcissist begins to see that their influence is no longer automatic. The person they once controlled emotionally is now capable of functioning without constant reassurance or guidance. Independence also changes the emotional tone of the relationship. When someone is dependent, they often tolerate behaviors that would otherwise feel unacceptable. They may overlook criticism, ignore manipulation, or remain silent during uncomfortable interactions because they fear losing the relationship. An independent person approaches the relationship differently. Because their sense of stability does not rely on the narcissist, they feel more comfortable speaking honestly and protecting their boundaries. They recognize that their well-being is not dependent on maintaining the narcissist's approval. This emotional stability can be very confusing for a narcissistic personality. Many narcissists rely on emotional reactions to maintain their influence. They expect others to become anxious, defensive, or eager to prove themselves. But when someone remains calm and confident in their own decisions, the usual patterns stop working. It is important to understand that independence does not mean hostility. A person can still treat the narcissist with politeness and respect. The difference is that respect no longer comes from fear or dependence. It comes from personal choice. True independence often grows gradually. It may begin with small steps, such as making personal decisions without seeking approval or pursuing goals that were once postponed. Over time, these steps rebuild self-trust. The person reconnects with their own identity and realizes they are capable of directing their life without constant validation from someone else. As this independence strengthens, the narcissist begins to recognize that their role has changed. They are no longer the emotional center of the other person's world. For someone who built their ego around influence and control, this quiet realization can be deeply uncomfortable. Now expand the fourth keynote with no subbotting in detail, output in 700 words. Refusing to argue or defend yourself endlessly is one of the most effective ways to disrupt the psychological patterns a narcissistic person depends on. At first, this may feel counterintuitive. Most people are taught that when they are criticized, misunderstood, or accused of something unfair, they should explain themselves clearly and defend their position. In healthy relationships, this can be productive. Honest discussion helps resolve misunderstandings and allows both people to understand each other better. However, when dealing with a narcissistic personality, arguments often serve a completely different purpose. Instead of being a path to understanding, they become a tool for control. Narcissistic individuals frequently turn disagreements into long, exhausting debates where the goal is not truth or resolution, but dominance. In these conversations, the narcissist may question every detail of what you say. They might interrupt your explanations, reinterpret your words, or bring up unrelated past events to weaken your position. Even when you provide clear reasoning, they may dismiss it or twist it into something that makes you appear wrong. Over time, these patterns can create a sense of confusion and emotional fatigue. The person defending themselves may begin to feel as if nothing they say is ever enough. They might spend long periods trying to clarify their intentions or prove that their actions were reasonable. But the more they explain, the more material the narcissist has to analyze, criticize, or distort. This creates a cycle that can feel endless. The narcissist introduces criticism or an accusation. The other person explains themselves. The narcissist challenges the explanation. The person explains further. And the conversation stretches on, sometimes for hours, without ever reaching a genuine resolution. From the narcissist's perspective, this cycle is useful. As long as the other person is defending themselves, the narcissist remains in control of the conversation. They determine the direction of the discussion, the standards of judgment, and the emotional tone of the interaction. Refusing to engage in these endless arguments quietly breaks that cycle. Instead of responding with long explanations or emotional defenses, the person keeps their responses brief and calm. They may simply acknowledge the disagreement without trying to convince the narcissist. For example, they might say, "I see that you feel that way," or "I've already explained my decision," or "We're going to have to disagree on that." These statements may seem simple, but they change the structure of the conversation. They do not invite further debate. They do not offer new details for the narcissist to challenge. They simply close the door to the endless cycle of argument. For the narcissistic individual, this can be deeply frustrating. Narcissists often rely on extended debates to maintain influence. The longer the conversation continues, the more opportunities they have to reshape the narrative or push the other person into emotional reactions. When someone refuses to stay in the argument, the narcissist loses that stage. They may attempt to reopen the debate by repeating their criticism or raising their voice. They might accuse the other person of avoiding the issue or claim that they are being unreasonable. These tactics are often designed to pull the person back into the argument, but when the calm refusal remains steady, the strategy loses power. Another important effect of refusing endless arguments is the protection of emotional energy. Narcissistic debates can be incredibly draining. They often involve circular logic, shifting accusations, and emotional intensity that leaves the other person feeling exhausted. By stepping away from these debates, the person preserves their mental clarity. They recognize that not every criticism deserves a long defense and that not every accusation requires proof of innocence. This shift also reflects a deeper form of self-trust. When someone constantly defends themselves, it can signal that they feel their decisions must be approved or validated by the other person. But when they stop engaging in endless arguments, they communicate something different. They communicate confidence in their own judgment. They are no longer trying to win approval or persuade the narcissist to see things their way. Instead, they accept that disagreement may exist without needing to resolve it through prolonged conflict. For many people, reaching this point takes practice. The instinct to defend oneself is strong, especially when faced with unfair criticism. But over time, individuals begin to recognize that many narcissistic arguments are not genuine attempts at understanding. They are invitations into a game where the rules constantly change. Refusing to play that game is often the most effective response. The conversation becomes shorter, the emotional intensity decreases, and the narcissist finds fewer opportunities to manipulate the interaction. This does not mean the narcissist will stop trying to provoke arguments. In many cases, they will continue testing the boundary, but the difference is that the other person no longer participates in the exhausting cycle that once gave the narcissist so much control. Instead of long debates and emotional defenses, the interaction becomes simple and clear. A calm statement, a brief response, and sometimes silence. For someone who depends on arguments to maintain psychological dominance, that silence can feel far more uncomfortable than any confrontation.